Honorable Mr. Soros, Honorable President Buzek, honorable guests. It is a privilege to address you at the Conference on National Roma Integration Strategies and share my thoughts with you concerning the international effort aiming at the social inclusion of Roma, Europe's most populous and most excluded ethnic minority. It was 8 years ago that 8 countries, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Macedonia and the former Serbia-Montenegro committed themselves under the guidance of the world's most experienced and financially robust international organizations to bridge the gap between the living conditions of Roma and the majority population. Later on, joined by Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Spain, the 12 countries together with the World Bank, the Open Society Institute, UNDP, the Council of Europe and UNICEF, to name but a few of the prestigious stakeholders, decided to dedicate the 10 years between 2005 and 2015 to these noble goals. Having passed more than half of the proposed duration of this ambitious scheme, however, we cannot but conclude that the projects related to the decade have not yielded the expected results. Despite that significant institutional and financial input and effort, the situation of the European Roma in the priority fields of the decade, namely their extreme high unemployment, their lack of access to quality education, the substandard housing and their troubling health indicators, have not improved in the past years, but rather deteriorated and therefore continue to weaken Europe's social cohesion and economy as a whole. As the 2010 evaluation report of the Budapest-based Kurt Lewin Foundation for Tolerance ascertains, due to the lack of proper monitoring, coordination, transparency and official commitment on behalf of the concerned authorities, neither the effectiveness nor the efficiency of the program can be ensured. I'm convinced that my fellow speakers will highlight several of the specific shortcomings that have emerged, so please let me just give you a brief overview of what I consider the 2 most important aspects: the evaluation of projects on one hand, and how the recently launched EU framework strategy on Roma inclusion might remedy the lack of policy coordination and supervision on the other hand. I believe that the most important conclusion to be drawn here is what we must make a clear and strict distinction between good practices and those projects that have obviously failed. For this purpose, it is necessary to extend the scope of rules and monitoring. It is a well-known truth in the corporate world that we can learn almost as many lessons from the unsuccessful initiatives as from the productive ones. An expensive and time-consuming lesson in this case, a very painful one from the point of the Roma, whose non-involvement or weak leadership also contributed to the fact that supposedly only few % of EU, governments or private funding has actually reached the Roma in the past 20 years. It is equally important, therefore, to have at hand a catalogue of worst practices as well, a list of mistakes to avoid, complemented with a register of those projects that are successful, but only due to such limited and specific factors that make them impossible to transpose under different circumstances. By listing the most common traps and barriers and knowing which initiatives cannot operate in a different policy field or geographical area, we can develop a mechanism for early warning, so that any specific projects or action in difficulties could be addressed with a view to resolving the problems as rapidly as possible. Furthermore, even those projects that are accepted as good practices and are proposed to be scaled up to a higher level must be independently and impartially analyzed in order to avoid either the contractors themselves evaluating their projects or falling for the hooray-optimistic reports of government-financed and politically engaged NGOs. Despite its doubtful results in the field, the decade has introduced some very good proposals and ideas to build on further. To mention but one, it was the first ever framework to bring together candidate countries and EU member states to cooperate in fostering the Roma inclusion, a feature that must indeed be empathic in the enlargement process. Enlargement countries with special regard to the Roma population of the Western Balkans must be involved into the European level pursuit of Roma integration from the very first stage. since accession negotiations provided an unparalleled opportunity to trigger a substantial shift in governmental attitudes toward granting equal access to Roma in employment, education, housing and healthcare. Finally, let me say a few words about the recently adopted European Framework for National Roma Inclusion Strategy and its expected added value. Building on the belief that the socio-economic inclusion of Roma is possible, desirable and above all necessary for our future, and that there would be a substantial benefit from the involvement of the EU in such a long-term initiative, the basic aim of the EU strategy was to create a long-term framework in which, as member states come together to cooperate on specific measures, the general oversight would be within the community structures with periodic reports and recommendations. The framework strategy was therefore adopted as a place-based and inclusive action plan that is prepared and implemented on a multi-level basis, that is indicative, inclusive and able to evolve as needed where the crucial responsibilities are placed at the most appropriate level, which is usually as low as possible, rather than Brussels taking over. Following the report of the European Parliament that I had the opportunity to be the rapporteur of, the strategy rejects the creation of a new body on the EU level. It would be unnecessary, it would create a wasteful overhead, and the introduction of a new institution player would only increase the institutional opacity in a situation where, as seen in the decade structure, improving the cooperation among bodies and policy networks, eliminating parallel, overlapping or conflicting efforts, and creating synergies would be utmost necessary. The strategy therefore imposes the role of supervising, coordinating and monitoring the strategy, as well as to harmonize national action plans and the EU framework of the Commission, hoping that as an independent, multi-sectoral body, it can serve as an external facilitator to assess and balance the various national and sectorial interests in a manner acceptable to all. In this regard, it is extremely important that the Commission has recently confirmed that despite any political upheaval or budgetary hardship in some of the Member States, they were expecting the submission of the national Roma action plans until the end of this year. The Commission also confirmed that after thorough evaluation covering the professional substantiations, complexity and financial feasibility of the national strategies, the Commission would also present specific recommendations for their revision and would report annually on the progress of integration and the achievement of the goals. Altogether, it seems that the Commission is ready to undertake the leading role in the strategic coordination of the key delivery stages. Facing the future and implementing this multi-level strategy, each according to the measure of this individual capacity, from the local mayors up to the European Council, we should be neither timid pessimist nor hasty optimist. It takes at least 6 years. It takes at least 6 years until we can feel the change in the settlements, and even longer to produce substantive progress. But the goal for Roma to become equal European citizens can definitely be achieved. We must recognize the multitude of dangers that exist and that threaten the success of this strategy. We should neither overestimate them nor shrink from them, but steadily overcome them one by one, doing our best in our own capacities in the concentrated effort to overcome the historic exclusion of the continent's largest and most vulnerable ethnic minority. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful conference.